My name's Holly McCall. This is Up to Us in Welcome Home Westchester, welcoming you all to a community conversation on the Westchester housing crisis. I just want to cover a few housekeeping items before we really start getting into it. And while we still have some folks filtering in, Welcome Home Westchester campaign is providing the logistical support. So Anika is here with us. She'll be making sure that everyone stays on mute. So we don't have any background noise like my dog banging on the door in the background. So please make sure that if you're not on mute, you put yourself on mute now unless you're speaking. And if you have any issues and you need any help, just use the chat function during the program. If you do have any questions you want to ask while we're presenting, you could put those into the chat. We'll try to address them as we go. And at the end, we will have an interactive question and answer period. We'll use our digital hands at that point to bring people online to ask questions. My name's Holly McCall. I'm a resident of Newcastle and I'm a founding member of Up to Us, currently serving as a treasurer, and one of my pet issues is housing. So that's why I'm bringing this issue to everyone in this presentation. A little bit about Up to Us. We're an all-volunteer nonprofit civic education organization. We're founded after the 2016 election. We seek to ensure equality for everyone and protection of rights and resources. We do that by supporting and electing candidates with integrity and vision in every race, from the local level to the federal level, by educating, organizing, and getting out the vote. We've got some other board members on from Up to Us, and I don't have everybody on my screen, so I hopefully won't miss anyone, but I see Randy Glazer and Iris Lachaud. I saw Francesca Hagedis and Kristen Lohr, I believe I saw, and Beth Sauerhaft is on with us, Terry Degatano, and if I'm not seeing somebody else, I apologize. But we've been working together, and like I said, we're an all-volunteer organization. I'll share some links at the end of the presentation if you want to learn more about us or support some of our efforts. And I think we have some electeds on with us as well. I saw that Catherine Parker, and we have some guest speakers, Dana Levenberg, and I saw Victoria Hubble. If I missed anybody, again, please accept my apology. And Alex Rothmayer is with us from Welcome Home Westchester, as well as Tim Foley. And I'm gonna let Alex talk a little bit about the Welcome Home Westchester campaign, and take it away, Alex.
Thank you, Holly, and I want to thank everyone. First, I want to thank Up to Us for partnering with Welcome Home Westchester and the BRI on putting this together. There's a lot of places you could have been at on a Monday night, but you chose to be here on this Zoom to talk about something we all know and are living, and that's the housing crisis, the affordable housing crisis in Westchester. So once again, this is a great turnout. It's something that we've been looking to do for a while. So without further ado, I'll further introduce myself and the Welcome Home Westchester campaign. 1 second. I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Like I said, my name is Alex Rothmayer. I am the Strategic Research Associate for the BRI, but more importantly for tonight, I am the lead coordinator for the Welcome Home Westchester campaign. So a little bit about what I'll be going over. I'll do an overview about what the Welcome Home Westchester campaign is, what do we believe about housing in Westchester and what we can bring change to, and a brief summary about what the last year of us operating have been like. So first off, what is the Welcome Home Westchester campaign? I like to describe us as one part an educational campaign and one part is building a constituency of like-minded individuals. But more importantly, we're a group made up of multi-stakeholders. We intend to shine a spotlight on the everyday barriers to provide the housing that we need and encourage our communities to make a different and better choices. And we believe in doing so, we believe that we'll secure a better future and prosperity for all, because we believe that most things, if not everything, comes back to housing. Wrong way. So who is guiding us? Like I said, we're a multifaceted organization, many stakeholders. We're made up of the building development and the construction community, the business community, as well, such as the Westchester County Association, nonprofit partners such as Nonprofit Westchester, which I believe I saw Jan Fisher on, to Child Care Council, Lifting Up Westchester, West Hab, Community Housing Initiatives, the Yonkers Family YMCA, and Westchester's Children's Association, Allison Lake, as well as housing specialists, including the Housing Action Council, Habitat for Humanity, PACE, or University Urban Lawn Center, as well as our faith leaders. So why does this campaign exist? This campaign exists because we believe at Welcome Home Westchester and our steering committee that housing is a fundamental. It is the oxygen of our local economies and attracting employees. It's important to secure our families and makes a difference for our kids as well as our community as a whole. Where did we come from? We came out of the need from multifaceted organization that were feeling the housing crisis in many different ways. But more importantly, we really got started after the county put the 2019 housing needs assessment study together. And they did a great job of really outlining how truly devastating the housing crisis here is in Westchester. As you can see on your screen, the report said in 2019, there's a need for 8,241 affordable units to deal with the issue of affordability, substandard housing, severe overcrowding, or those who are seeking housing but cannot find affordable housing in the present day. This report also included that during current demand, this was 2019 demand, we already needed to construct over 11,000 new units of housing. So taking this as a fire in our belly, we created a Welcome Home Westchester campaign to take this on. There we go. All right, I think it's a little bit important for us to talk about some of the language that we like to use. Some of that, different types of housing. Too much housing conversations are focused on, a McMansion versus a luxury apartment. But there's many different types of housing. And as we move forward in this conversation, the open part of this conversation, I thought this was important to point out that there is different types of housing, especially the missing middle, what we're looking for. And that includes affordable and workforce housing, middle income housing, seniors housing, housing for millennials, housing near transit-oriented communities and train stations, housing for the disabilities, supportive market rates housing as well, housing in cities, towns, and villages, and housing of all shapes and sizes. If there's a will, there's a unit, is what I'm trying to say, and to break us out of just some of our nomenclature of what kind of housing we envision. All right, so a little bit about what Welcome Home Westchester has been doing. Another thing we thought we would define was what we mean by housing burden and affordable housing. What we mean by that is any housing that is 30% of more of a household income goes to housing is housing burden, and they're looking for affordable housing. That is not an affordable option. That was important to bring up. So, like I said, Welcome Home Westchester will be turning about 1 year old in June, and we have had a very successful year of spreading the word about our existence, as well as pointing out a few studies I would like to quickly walk you through. Back in September, we started with our first white paper, making the argument and talking about the economic benefits of building the housing we need. As you can see in the picture of me in a ill-fitting suit, we were happy to support this. But what the report outlined was that one of the best economic benefits to any community is investment in housing. Right here in this, you can see that the 1 year impact of building 100 unit multifamily construction creates over 150,000 jobs and over $10 million. And then the recurring annual impact of that is 44 jobs, continuous jobs, as well as $2.6 million of income. When compared to investments in our highways and our streets, multifamily housing is by far one of the best investments of tax dollars that we can be using. And on a government function, the amount of tax dollars that are generated by investing in housing and giving people the housing that we need has thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars, in benefits year over year. Something else we have done is we studied the school populations in relations to multifamily studies, multifamily unit developments. One of the things that we dealt with a lot was hearing from NIMBYs, people who, not in my backyard, love to cite that if you build multifamily housing, that the school populations, the schools will just be overcrowded. And study after study has shown that that's not the case. Well, Welcome Home Westchester took it upon ourselves to do a study about here in Westchester. And what we found was these recent housing development did not have a major impact on school enrollment. In none of the multifamily resident projects that we, with at least 100 units examined, did children associated with the project and enrollment in the local school districts equal to exceed 1% of the school's total enrollment. And in all cases, the project generated a net positive benefit to the school taxes. I'm going to say that again. All these projects have net benefit to local schools when you build multifamily housing. So not only we sat out to just study the NIMBY talking point that multifamily housing relates to, will cause school overpopulation, and we found the exact opposite. So another reason why we should be investing in multifamily housing and taking on the housing crisis head on. And that's what Welcome Home Westchester does and what we've done. And I'll get into part two of what our call to action would be a little bit later. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's really interesting to see that some of the things that we might hear a lot of as sound bites, that maybe if we dig a little bit deeper, they may not be as accurate when we get into some of the data. So that's really interesting to see. And you said you'll be able to share those studies in the white papers with this group afterwards as well. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like in the trenches. And Dana Levenberg, the Ossining Town Supervisor, is going to be able to talk a little bit about that with us. Her experience and service to both the communities of Ossining and Briarcliff and her work with New York State Assemblywoman Sandy Galiff's office give her an excellent perspective on the challenges facing communities in Westchester. She knows what it means to work with and within the communities addressing the housing crisis with a view from the proverbial trenches. So we welcome her to share that view with us tonight. Dana?
Holly and Alex, thank you so much for inviting me this evening. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and nice to see some friends and colleagues. So I'm glad to see all of you here this evening. There's a couple of things that I wanted to talk a little bit about. We recently, we're actually in the process right now of developing a new comprehensive plan. The last one was drafted originally in 2002 and then updated again in 2015. And we applied for a grant through New York State to develop a comprehensive plan with sustainability elements. And what I can tell you is the biggest pushback that we receive is about adding more density to the community. If one of the things I will explain is that the town of Ossining, the parts of the Ossining that we have jurisdiction over for zoning and planning is the unincorporated town of Ossining, which is probably more of a bucolic setting than you might think of for, for Village of Ossining, which is a little bit denser. But we certainly have the ability to expand housing. And even, as recently as we're really right in the middle of finalizing our draft right now. And very recently we received comments from the county that we really hadn't done enough to establish affordable housing. And this was one of the targets and one of the things that came up again and again when we talked to people about housing. But when we start getting down to nuts and bolts and what does that actually look like, there is pushback, right? There's pushback. And it really is, and people resent being called NIMBYs. They don't want to think that it's something that, that they are against. So it's theoretically like, I want affordable housing. I just don't necessarily want it here in my neighborhood. We know that, traditionally that, that zoning, I think, was put in place a long time ago to basically to, I think, I don't think it's just my opinion. I think it's proven, but I don't know that it's laid out anywhere this evening, but to sort of draw some lines in the sand that we might think of it in a color of red, and that we really don't that really laid out racist policies about housing. And it's very difficult to undo some of the work that was put in place so many years ago when those those plans for what could be here and what could be there were first established. And I think that trying to get at the root of that now is very difficult, because we have these entrenched communities of single family homes. One of the things that we've been looking at is developing this missing middle housing in a different way than just large multifamily developments, because that's another thing that I think people are having a problem imagining, right? How is that going to be? How would that impact my community where I live? I live in this, again, bucolic, a lot of I hear a lot of times people say they live in this very rural area of Westchester, which always humors me, because oftentimes they're right on the on the edge of Route 9A or something, but they have a lot of trees in their backyard, so it feels like they're in a rural setting, or they may have a big backyard or something like that, and maybe they have chickens. So I think it's difficult for people to imagine what a denser community could look like. And many of us, probably many people on this call, raise their hands and say, I live in a single family home and I really like that. That's why I moved to the suburbs, to get away from the city, to get away from, that people right butted up against each other. But we also know that we have a housing crisis. And Alex, you're doing a great job with those slides, but you undercounted by, by a few 100,000. It's or not 100,000, but it was 82,000, not 8,000 units of housing that we need in Westchester County. And I think that, we all have to do our part to figure out how to get that done. I think that, knowing that there are so many of you on this call and, in our communities working hard for the needs, to actually improve outcomes for those who are under-resourced, but also just to build better communities, healthy communities, access to, to nutritious food, access to public transportation, access to healthcare, all of those things. Like we need to have walkable, bikeable communities, and we can fit more units into the same amount of space that we currently have and not destroy or disrupt what we have right now. I think that, again, it's hard to imagine, but I think we need to start painting a picture. And one of the things that we're looking to do coming up shortly in Austin is actually, what is it going to look like if we were to be sort of built out in this way, where we start looking at this, quote unquote, missing middle housing, where you might have anywhere from 2 to 4 units in something that looks a lot like a single family home, but isn't a giant apartment complex, but really houses more people. And I think, we really need to start getting folks to attend some of these comprehensive plan meetings and understand, like, that's where the rubber meets the road, because that's where our communities are laying out a plan for their future. We do have some advocates pushing back, and I don't know that IFCA's on this call, but Jackie Shaw, who's the executive director of IFCA, was on our town board. And that's, one of our affordable housing agencies in Ossining, and she recently shared nonprofit Westchester's myths about multifamily housing, and I think that was such a great document. Jan, I'm not sure who was all responsible for that, but we're looking at how are ways that we can utilize that to educate our community. This is not something to be fearful of. The other thing we know is we don't have the YIMBYs. We don't have a lot of people who are out there saying yes in my backyard. We don't have the people who are going to live in these homes necessarily here or fighting for them. People are fighting, our people are here. That doesn't necessarily mean that the new people coming in are going to not add to the fabric of our community. I've heard time and again that this one non-affordable housing structure, which is multifamily, is a monstrosity. It is a monstrosity. Again, it was just recently built, so obviously all of the landscaping hasn't grown in yet, and people are very afraid of the traffic impacts, and I've driven on the road that that is impacted by this, and maybe I'm not there all the time at rush hour, but and you know what, that's also it's another challenge that we need to look at, which is transportation, so that we can start getting away from our highly trafficked highways and byways, because it does stop people in their tracks, and it does make it difficult for people to get to work on time. But these roads that I drive on, it's there might be a half hour here, a half hour there a day when they're going to be negatively impacted by additional housing, but those are homes for people. I just spoke to a woman recently who moved into the monstrosity, and she couldn't be happier. She said it's the most wonderful place to live. She is so happy it's there. And now she's actually somebody who lived in Ossining. She moved to Cortland, I think, or Peekskill. She's now back in Ossining, and she's found a wonderful place to live. This was probably luxury apartments, but with a 10% set aside at 60% AMI. So we have managed to create a few more affordable units, and slowly but surely we're chipping away, but it is so difficult. It's so difficult to build and to expand unless you're building single family homes. So I think that we really need, an infusion of people who are area median income. We need an infusion of, sorry, I just saw that the chat said AMI, sorry. So 60% of area median income. We need an infusion of people who are yes in my backyard, who are willing to go to the planning board, who are and fight back against people who are saying, and believe me, people come out in huge numbers, and I get it. It seems intimidating that we're going to have all this building, but it's not. Some of it is really not that far from the condominiums or the multifamily housing that we have, but it's being built in a place that maybe it didn't have that. I think as we look at what is available, how can we look for adaptive reuse of properties? How can we look for expanding within and I like to say the characteristics or the building characteristics of our communities. I think then, maybe we can start to have more success as we start to see some of these developments be built, and then we can point to them for the next community and look at that. One of the other challenges that we recently faced, and I think I saw Mike on here from Senator Harkin's office, Mike Weinberg. Are you still on? I don't know if you jumped on and jumped off, but one of the things that Senator introduced was accessory dwelling unit legislation. Hi, you're still there. And there was tremendous pushback from my colleagues around Westchester County that we were threatening a home rule, right? And home rule where localities really get to decide their own rules about housing and also understand what is the infrastructure, what are the supports needed to support additional housing. So we introduced accessory dwelling unit legislation, which did get passed in the town, I think in 2017 probably. And luckily we didn't have pushback and we managed to get it passed, but there were some caveats that were in there that maybe we could actually seek to eliminate as we go forward to make it stronger. But not that many people have taken us up on it. I think we maybe have 30 accessory dwelling units now in the town of Ossining. And and I should say out of how many parcels, and I don't have that number at the top of my head, so I'm not 100% sure. But this is making it easier for people to age in place. It's making it, it might be making it easier for young people. I can tell you that the Working Families Party does not believe that ADUs are affordable options because they don't have any particular price tag attached to them. But my colleagues, again, in local government, and I'm sure you saw it because it was really out in the news, really pushed back hard on this ADU legislation. And I thought that, it was really interesting because it seemed to me like it's, again, it's sort of an interesting, like almost like a California-like way to say, okay, no more, we're going to take this from the top down instead of the bottom up. The bottom up isn't working. But I do also understand from my colleagues that, in many cases, maybe the infrastructure isn't there. So as we move forward, I think what we really need at the state level is some carrots, maybe instead of sticks. My colleague, Mayor Piconich in Mount Kisco had suggested sort of taking a police reform approach where we basically, the state would say, okay, you need, mandate this many units of new housing. You can take whatever tack you want, but and it's similar to the housing monitor, the federal housing monitor, but a little bit different, saying, you can take whatever tack you want, you understand what you need, but we're also going to help you with with some draft legislation. Here are some potential options for you. And we're also going to help fund any needed infrastructure to improve what you have so that you can support that additional housing. Because I think that's something that I've heard from a lot of, again, my colleagues in local government. So again, I think that there's a number of different pieces in the trenches that we're seeing. Again, this pushback against home rule, and we don't want the state sort of dictating what we do at the local level. But again, that is also the antithesis of actually moving forward on some of these housing options. I think at the state level, we're going to need to look at multi-level approaches to increasing our housing stock. And finally, at the grassroots level, we need help on this comprehensive plans. We need people to understand that this is really impacting your quality of life. This is impacting our futures. This is impacting our economic development. It's impacting our schools, and not necessarily negatively, although I did just read that study and I have some questions about it, but that's neither here nor there. Having been on the Osney School Board for 9 years, I also know, sort of that perspective, which is, okay, we're overcrowded, bursting at the seams. Where are we going to put, another bunch of kids? Well, guess what? We got to figure that out. So we need to figure out how we can not just pull up the ladder once we get here and make room for others. Because, if you have a great school district, if you have a school district that meets or exceeds the needs of the students who are going to be living in the district, then, you need to really make sure that you have room for others, even if you are you are tight. And that's something that, again, I think we can look in partnership with the building trades, the state, and look at how we fund the needed infrastructure like schools, to make sure that we can continue to support our communities going forward and continue to support safe, affordable housing. I think that's it. I rambled long enough.
Dana, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I actually wrote down a whole bunch of the phrases that you said. But I really liked what you said, that the bottom up doesn't seem to be working. But I also liked your perspective that you shared, that your colleague in Mount Kisco had said that maybe we need to talk about how we use a carrot and not a stick from the state as well. So hopefully there's some good thinking going on at some of the higher levels as well, so that we don't have the same reaction when things are being proposed like we did earlier this year. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that view from the trenches. There were a couple of questions. I know you touched on the ADUs briefly, but there was a question a little bit about transit-oriented development. Do you want to share a little bit of your thoughts on that as well before we move on?
I mean, I will only share that that hasn't exactly been something that I've had to tackle in the town, because we don't have a train station in the town, in the part of the town where, again, I have jurisdiction over land use, zoning, and planning. But I know that, again, some of the pushback was really about infrastructure. Even, I heard from, I think, the Mountain Vernon mayor was very opposed to TOD legislation. And I think there, that we need to look carefully at how that the infrastructure supports it, how is it going to impact the community? Like, how can we do it thoughtfully? I don't think there's any one size fits all approach. Again, I think that's what we're hearing most from our from my local colleagues in municipal government, that there's not a one size fits all approach. And I think, again, it's a big state, looking at, what rural New York or upstate New York is going to look like versus the city versus Westchester County. It's very, very different, and we each have our own set of challenges. So we do have to take, I think, a nuanced approach that is cognizant of those realities. And still, but with the overall understanding that we need more housing, and we have to figure it out. We have to figure out how we can get people into safe housing who are in unsafe housing, and how we can bring more people, to our communities, some of which are bursting at the seams, and support the infrastructure needs to make sure that we develop thoughtfully.
Great, thank you very much. And actually, you just mentioned that there are people that are in unsafe housing, and I think that's a really good transition to bring in Allison Lake, who's going to talk to us about the human cost of the housing crisis. Allison is the executive director of Westchester Children's Association. She joined the WCA in 1998. Brought over 25 years of experience in nonprofit and community work, both in the US and West Africa, as a Peace Corps volunteer. She's held management positions at the National Civic League and Associated Black Charities. She's worked in youth development with the City Volunteer Corps program in New York City and the YWCA of White Plains in Central Westchester. She's a homegrown Westchesterite. I didn't know that was a term, but I really like it. She lives in Greenberg with her husband, has 2 young adult children, and she's going to share with us the human cost of the housing crisis. Thank you, Allison. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Holly. Yeah, I just made that up, Westchesterite, sounded good. But thank you and Alec for inviting me to join the conversation this evening. For those of you who may not know, Westchester Children's Association is a multi-issue children's advocacy organization. Our mission is to ensure that all children are safe, healthy, and prepared for life's challenges. And we do our work around budgets and policy and legislation to ensure that all Westchester's children can thrive regardless of race or zip code. So very happy to be part of this conversation and the importance of housing, as was said at the top of the program. I think we'll all agree that housing affects people's health, education, and employment throughout their life. But it also affects the futures for their children and even their grandchildren. Homeownership is a primary means for wealth building and stability in the United States. And it's one of the primary reasons for the wealth gap amongst races and ethnicities here in the Westchester County and across the country. It was sort of alluded to in terms of the documented history of government-sanctioned policies and practices that excluded Black Americans and others from home ownership, and the resulting inability to accumulate intergenerational wealth continues to impact communities of color today. And so, yes, it's the roof over the head, but it's also sort of the long-term wealth building that it allows families to do when they have access to affordable, stable, and safe housing. To give people a fair chance to prosper, our communities must have enough affordable housing for working and middle-class families, and deeply affordable housing for those who are trying to move out of homelessness here in the county. and everything in between. I think as the town supervisor said, it's not a one size fits all for sure. We need a variety of housing options to accommodate our neighbors throughout Westchester. Westchester faces an urgent crisis at this moment in time. The cost of living and the lack of affordable housing represents a major threat to the vitality of our county. If we add the surge in housing costs that is always, in the news throughout the pandemic, and the rise in unemployment for some as a result of the COVID pandemic as well, there are those who say that we are really heading for a housing tsunami as some of the protections that were put in place in the pandemic are not being continued. And I think I know our Westchester attorneys and legal housing fees can probably talk better to that than I in terms of what families may be facing. So I know Alec mentioned the nonprofit Westchester survey that was done in 2021. Jan's on the phone, so I have to say that I am a proud board member, executive board member of nonprofit Westchester. And that survey was done for those in the nonprofit community. And we know that 41% of Westchester households are rent burdened, as Alex mentioned earlier, meaning that they use more than 30% of their income for housing costs. But that number jumps to 60% for those who work in the nonprofit community, and jumps to 70% for those who work in nonprofit and also are coming from communities of color. So, the essential workers that we all realized how much we depended upon during the pandemic and that we cared about. The slide that Alex showed had some of the salaries for health aides, childcare providers, maintenance workers. So for those who are providing that vital service for us, as well as those starting out in careers as firefighters or teachers or police, cannot afford to live in Westchester County. Young families starting out cannot afford to make Westchester their home. So this is something that all of us, need to really put our heads together and figure out how we're going to go forward on this. I wanted to give just a few numbers, again, that we sort of put together in the nonprofit Westchester survey that spoke about the median income in Westchester County, around 89,000. And that could get you a single family home that costs, let's say, 245,000. But the home price we know for single family home is closer to $730,000. So there's this huge gap between what people can afford and what it costs to, buy a home here in Westchester County. I'm not sure if people are familiar with another term, which is called ALICE, and United Way's nationally, including ours here in Westchester, put together data and information on the cost of living. ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. And it has a figure for just the minimum cost, again, to survive. So it is your housing, it's your childcare, it's food, it's transportation, it's a cell phone these days, which are more, essential than a luxury. It doesn't include saving for a rainy day or saving for children's college education. And for New York State, that ALICE number is at 78,000 for a family of 4. It's expensive to live in Westchester County, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here that we all know that. But what I wanted to spend a little time on are those families that are below that ALICE number or the median income that I spoke of early. Almost 30% of Westchester families with children are below that ALICE threshold of $78,000. So what does that mean for children and families who don't have safe, adequate, and stable housing? In 2019, Westchester Children's Association did a report called Making the Invisible Visible. We wanted to understand a little more what happens to families that don't have the secure housing. And in Westchester, what it looks like is people that are doubled up and tripled up in what should be single family homes, and they are invisible to many. The Department of Education defines students who find themselves in this overcrowded housing, doubled or tripled up, as homeless. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, does not. And that's part of the problem and part of the advocacy that my organization is doing in trying to expand the definition of homelessness, which is so important for a county like Westchester, where we really have an overcrowded a problem. But it's HUD that allows a family to seek out any services and supports. It's the HUD definition that allows them to get any supports around seeking permanent housing, not the Department of Education definition, unfortunately. So we researched the physical, emotional, and personal hardships that being unstably housed can have on children's health and well-being. The experience of insecure housing affects children and youth differently depending on their age, for sure, but can start even before birth, where there'll be fewer well visits or late prenatal care from the mom. There are higher rates of maternal mental illness for families who experience this type of homelessness, more likely to have pregnancy complications, to be in poor health, less access to health care, lacking essential immunizations, and et cetera. And all of this, we know, costs taxpayers money when things are not done right for children and families from the beginning, and can certainly impair a child's well-being. For school-age children, the constant change in housing can cause acute stress, which accumulates over time and is associated with adverse outcomes of higher mental health disorders, behavioral issues, anxiety and depression. We know that they're 3 times more likely to have emotional disturbances, 4 times more likely to be delayed developmentally. Half of homeless children are held back 1 grade in school, and 22% are held back for multiple grades. Chronic absenteeism is twice the rate of overall students for those who find themselves in housing insecurity, and they're 87% more likely to drop out of high school, 87%. So we're talking about the future of our young people when we don't give them access to safe, affordable, and secure housing. And it's something that I know everyone that has joined us tonight certainly cares about. I think we can appreciate even more the need for safe housing with a pandemic, when we were all told to, house and shelter in place and distance from our neighbors. How do you do that when you're in an overcrowded situation with 2 or 3 families? How does a child go to school remotely? Again, when sharing space with multiple families and probably not even access to affordable and adequate Wi-Fi, which is another issue. That's for another night, but something else that WCA also is advocating for. If we think back just to the recent storms, and unfortunately we're having more weather systems than ever before, and the communities of Portchester and Mamaroneck were really hit hard. And again, we see what happens when families are not in safe housing, and many of them have been displaced and have not been able to come back to their homes at this time. So, we and WCA, we use data all the time to base our advocacy on, but I think it's important that we remember the humans behind the data, behind the statistics, when we give sort of the analysis that we do, that we're talking about people. And so I agree, Dana, you said just the front page news of everything that is housing. We're at this moment of time, I think, in terms of looking at the housing market, looking at affordable housing, looking at what kind of supportive housing is needed depending on the needs of people. And as I said, even into deep affordable housing that we need here in Westchester. So we have the attention of elected officials, of municipalities, of the developers, of the nonprofits. And so I really hope that we can use it to our advantage. The causes of homelessness can vary. The most common are economic challenges, and coming off of the pandemic, as I said, that is a big one. But domestic violence, family issues, health conditions, mental illness, and lack of affordable housing. So, many of us know people that are in those situations, and maybe they're fortunate enough to have a support system that can help them through those difficult times. But many of our neighbors do not. And then they find themselves, into homelessness and seeking supportive housing and affordable housing. And so I'm here to sort of roll up my sleeves with the rest of you and see what we can do to really improve the situation for our neighbors, and invite the conversation ahead. And thank you, Alex, again, for inviting me.
Allison, thank you so much for kind
Thank
of
you.
giving that, that human picture to the impacts of this housing crisis and why it's important for us as activists to take some action. And Alex is going to tell us,
Speaking of action,
what we can do. So Alex, go ahead.
Yep.
What we can do, we no problem make it sound with it.
1 second. Let's bring it up again. Okay, part 2 of my. So the supervisor said it. Started using the word YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, and that's really what we're looking at. Is we're really looking to build a YIMBY community throughout Westchester in every town. So what are some of the steps that you can do today on a hyper-local level to combat the Westchester housing crisis? Well, the main thing is get involved. If your town or village does not yet have a committee on affordable housing or affordable housing committee, ask your elected officials to establish one. That is probably the simplest things you can do. Either there is an organization you can join with today, or be the vanguard that gets this or gets your community mobilized in a YIMBY fashion. Some important parts of that are educate yourself. There's a lot of material. Some of it I shared in the chat here, but have you read the housing needs assessment? It's very well done in outlining the crisis. Take an action, host a community forum. This is a great avenue, the Zoom avenue that we do, but one of the best ways that you can be proactive about the housing crisis instead of reactive when Albany or a developer comes in is to start hosting communities and have the conversation on your terms. It's not what we're trying to keep out, but what are we going to build in our town? What are we going to build in our cities? Involvement. Do you know when your planning boards meet? When your zoning boards meet? Planning and zoning boards are volunteer organizations. Do they have any openings? This would be a good time to really get involved on that one. Speaking of volunteer planning and zoning boards, is your planning and zoning board completing the mandatory training? New York State mandates that every municipality has to offer 4 hours of training for planning and zoning board members, but they do not go into what that training needs to be and if that training never is done. So that is a great level, that is a great opportunity on a local level, one, to make sure that the people on the planning board and zoning boards do have a certain level of education, an education that I think you can dictate and agree with. We suggest the housing needs assessment as one of the things, and we also think that it's important to find and outline a historic linkage between zoning and racial segregation. We suggest the color of law to outline how all of our communities can be complicit in this and where we are today. And then one of the things that you can also do is a little more tedious, but re-examine old and inadequate or exclusionary zoning practices, particularly parking requirements and that they go into. We're actually putting a parking study together, and we'll be putting that out soon. But many people are surprised that there are parking requirements for every unit created in the town code. Example, I'll say Town A says that and this law is about 40 years old, every housing unit that gets built needs to come with 2 parking spots and 0.5 parking spots on top of that for every bedroom. Regardless if the unit in question being built is close to public transit or not. That's old and antiquated language that we need to look. And there's an environmental factor there, as well as a better land use practice we can do. And I can go on and on, but I thought those are a good 1, 2, 3 about how we might be able to get involved on a local level. And I think now I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Alex. So I wanted to point out, there's a question that came up in the chat. It's about the housing needs assessment that I'm hoping maybe you can answer. Does the housing needs assessment cover the great need for housing in the intellectual developmental disability community? And is that something that's on the Welcome Home Westchester agenda?
The answer is yes. To what extent, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know it is included. And then the second question, absolutely. You know, when we talk about the missing middle of housing, and disability and supportive housing is exactly what we're looking at. You know, I think we come back to transit-oriented communities. You know, the individual disability community can really benefit from liberalization of the way we look at our land use on that one. So absolutely, individual with disability housing or disability community and providing them housing is definitely part of our lexicon of what we're advocating for.
So
and we're always looking for more partners on the steering committee to make sure that we're doing it in the right way.
So I think now would be a great time to have our kind of interactive question and answer time. So if anybody wants to ask a question, I think we can, you can use your digital hands to ask a question if you don't want to put them into the chat. And you know, so if everyone knows how to find their digital hand, you can go ahead with that. Actually, do we have the digital hand? Oh yeah, it's under reactions if you don't see it. Or you can put your questions into the chat. And I see a recommendation to compile some best practices from around the state and country.
Oh, I've written that one down. That is something that I think it's a great suggestion. And just on that, you know, there's some areas that have done better when it came to providing housing stock and reusing land than others. One of them, for better word, is Buffalo has taken the Rust Belt and turned that into pretty unique housing options. We don't have locks and dams as much here and stuff, but we do have underused office parks that often provide a lot of RA parking and a certain amount of resources, and they tend to be away from other clusters. So I view our underused office parks as our area's Rust Belt. So that's one, but that was a great question. A great thought.
Great, and we'll take down the note about the Westchester Municipal Planning Federation land use training. So thank you for sharing that as well.
Yeah, and as Dana, if you want, supervisor, if you want to say your comment out loud, just there is training options out there. But I don't want to. If you want to expand on your
it wasn't my comment, but yeah, actually I'm on the Westchester Municipal Planning Federation, but the comment part about free, that part was my comment. But the Westchester Municipal Planning Federation does offer excellent training in land use, zoning, planning, and lots of related subjects. So they're a great organization, and check out their training upcoming.
And I see a raised hand. Francesca, do you want to unmute?
Yes, I do. Hi, thank you so much. One of my pet peeves has always been the lack of efficient east-west transportation in Westchester County. Our Metro North stations have always been built for the people commuting into the city. And now if you look at our commuter parking lots, even with going back to work, they're half full. So I live in Pleasantville. In order for me to get by Beeline bus to Ossining, it would take me almost an hour and a half. And that's ridiculous, you know, I mean, and buses are not used that much for that reason. People would rather buy a broken down car and drive themselves than get from here to there, east-west. The buses don't run very frequently. They're half empty. There is no east-west transportation in this public transportation. If you don't have a car, forget it. And you know, I think that that's one of the key ways to develop to attract good housing, is to be able to say to people, well, you may not work in New York City and may not have to take Metro North, but you can get from mid Westchester over to the river towns in 15 minutes because we have shuttles that run, or we have, you can take a train to White Plains and get a light rail that goes across, you know, that nothing like that exists. And it's been years since I've been talking about this. You know, if you look at people who clean houses, they are taking trains into Manhattan so that they can take a train back to somewhere else. I mean, you know, I don't understand why the subways don't hook up to 125th Street. Well, we know why, but at this day and age, it shouldn't be that way. You know, it's ridiculous. I mean, public transportation has to be redone, rethought, reinvented, and re-implemented. Thanks.
Thanks. Dana, you look like you may have
I don't have the answer, but I have some upcoming suggestions that are, I just want to point to another resource, 511 New York Rideshare. They are actually very involved in looking at you know, alternative transportation options. And they have a whole sort of package of different, you know, alternative transportations, one of which is van pooling, right? And ride sharing, which are options in some cases to address this. In many cases, they'll actually find ways, you know, they'll partner with employers to identify ways for people to get to work in van pools or in ride shares. And also there are subsidies sometimes available to help people get back. Like if you got to work with one person and they're not going back at the same time as you, then they would pay for maybe, you know, an Uber or a taxi or something to get you back to where you needed to go. So that's just another interesting sort of upcoming alternative. New Rochelle introduced Circuit, which are sort of on-demand little mini, not vans. What are they called? Like you mentioned, like a like kind of like a trolley, but it's not a trolley because it's small. I don't know my words. Say it again. Shuttle, like a little shuttle, which is, you know, sort of a on demand. And it was, again, it's something that, you know, many of us have been looking into. A lot of these things haven't, and I think that, you know, Fran, you're saying like it's been a long time, and it has been a really long time, and it's too long, but there are some options sort of coming around the bend. Some of the other things that we've been looking at is putting together a bike share program with electric bikes or pedal assist bikes that people could use, especially for people who, you know, really can't afford cars. And of course, that's, you know, potentially weather dependent. It doesn't work in all weather conditions, but there's a potential to start to put together some of these different options. And 511 New York Rideshare is sort of at, there's a Hudson Valley version of them. I think they started in the city and funded by DOT, but there are, you know, there are looking at alternative transportation options that maybe could help out in some of those situations. Not there yet, but working on it.
Well, it's good to know that it's on the radar and some people are starting to work on it. I'm gonna point out one question from the chat, and then I'm gonna go over to you, Alexander. And just by way of a time check, we're a little bit after 8. So if you've got questions, we'll start wrapping these up. The question in the chat is there any consideration for the development of tiny home communities? Alex, is that something that you have any line of sight to, or maybe you, Dana?
It comes up. It's something that we see across the country, especially being used in California. And when and in the way, my broad terms and my 20,000 foot view, when we're talking about different units, I can put that in a lexicon on stuff like. But it seems from my conversations, it seemed a little bit more of a buzzword of what we were looking at. That being said, I can consider that, you know, mother-in-law suites, you know, there's many different ways to define a tiny home. And I think when we talk about the missing middle, tiny homes are a part of that. Not necessarily a tiny home that would be fun to see on a Netflix show about tiny homes, but I think a version of that term that would be functional and that would fit in Westchester. So in a way, yes, I think that is part of the lexicon.
we certainly have some communities who are built like as little bungalow or, communities or with second homes that could almost fit that description, not quite, because tiny homes are obviously a specific thing, but we haven't really talked a lot about them, but I think that it's a great option. And I think that, we should be working at those types of options into our conversations as well.
Okay. And Alexander, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I think I have unmuted.
Oh, yeah.
I've been very much enjoying this conversation, and I know a number of you. I have spoken to Joelle and Jan about a little different approach. It is so hard to get over the home rule aspect. It's just even if you have organizations. I know there was an organization that Rose Noonan had put together for each community, had its own sort of group that advocated affordable housing. But anytime a developer proposed something, they would just get swamped, So I've talked a bit about over the last couple of years of the idea of putting the shoe on the other foot, which would be simply making a simple requirement, a minimum requirement, that every community have at least 10% of their housing stock as affordable. And if it's not, they're required to bring that up to speed. So that would take it completely out of the realm of a developer proposing something, everybody saying that it doesn't work or this or that, and simply saying to the community, you know what, you have home rule responsibility, and we're making that responsibility 10%. Just let's start at 10%. And we don't care how you do it. You want to do it with ADUs, be our guest. You want to do it with multifamily housing? Great. If you want to do tiny house, that's great. But the point is, it would change the dynamic completely from us trying to specify something that the local communities are going to say, that doesn't fit in our community, the ADUs, that won't work. It's going to change the character of our neighborhood. So the point is, you put it on the local community to say, you've got to do 10%, and here is your 5-year plan to do it. And if you miss it, there are going to be these penalties that you're going to have to deal with. So,
Alex, that's exactly what I was talking about when I was saying carrot versus stick approach, 100%, which is, again, very similar to the police reform, which it's like, okay, you need to reform your police. What is your plan? Submit your plan to the state, that kind of thing. So I think that's excellent. Excellent suggestion.
So as I'm saying, because by the way, by doing this, you're saying this is our goal, but you're under home rule, you're required to do it, period. That's it. And you do it however you want. And you better provide us with a plan to do it. If you don't, if you don't stick to it, there are going to be certain penalties that are going to be assessed. And that's, I don't know. I'm just curious if it's anybody's thought of that, or I know they've thought of it, but if anybody's willing to try to use that approach.
The only other thing I would say is that there needs to be some money, again, that goes with that, I think, for infrastructure improvements, because, that's the other piece that we're going to hear push back. Well, we can't support it. We don't have the sewer. We don't have the water. We don't have, the roads, et cetera. So.
Well, that would be, bottom line is, then that would be provided. The state would be very happy, I think, to provide the sewerage or whatever that's needed to do it, So there are sources of funding for that to help those communities do it. We have a case right now where Yorktown is getting $10 million, and while they're supposed to have do 10% affordable, evidently the county executive has decided that they just won't do it. So he's going to give them the money anyway. So it's like it's a very much an uphill battle right now, I think.
Thank you both for that discussion. I noticed a little bit of a theme in the chat, and it's talking about money being available for some land acquisition, federal, state, or local, to purchase for affordable housing from private sales. I'm going to go ahead and admit that I don't completely understand the question. It looks like that was asked by Phil and Diane. I don't know if you want to ask the question or if maybe somebody understands the question better than me.
Yeah, just it wasn't for necessarily the purchase of the land, but to provide some sort of incentive to add to the purchase. In other words, if there's an organization who wishes to build and afford affordable housing, you have to be able to afford the land. So if there's a subsidy that could be provided to that private sale that allows it to be purchased for, again, affordable housing, incentive money, or tax breaks.
Okay.
Holly, could I add to that, please?
Please.
Okay, Community Land Trust is the vehicle that's being talked about. Community Land Trust are one of the ideas in the housing needs assessment. There are a number of groups who have experience with the housing need assessment proposal, including groups beginning to operate here in Westchester, like Habitat for Humanity. The idea is to get control of the land, one of the most expensive parts of being able to go forward with a project, and not only have control of it so that you can let the developer focus on efficient construction, but also to keep it as affordable in perpetuity.
Okay. Alex, is that something that you might be able to speak to if there's funds available there, or?
And I will say that we, yeah, a little bit, and some more knowledgeable, even happens to be my boss. Tim Foley is active in the chat answering some of these questions. I believe I'll read his answer. On the question of state and local dollars, there's a lot of funding that flows through communities. The county's capital investment in housing passes through budgets, was the largest amount in the county's history, and the state budget, if it passes. Would similarly be a huge investment in infrastructure, land acquisitions, etc. Unfortunately, some of these dollars in some communities that are hostile to housing or may not affect land use process will eat up a lot of those tax credits by either, scroll down, by either making it possible to build housing projects on an affordable scale, or dragging out the process for months or years in a way that costs a lot of money. When Tim brings up a good point, and something I didn't want to overload us too much, but something that I would like to talk about in the future with everyone individually is how important expectations of timelines are when you're putting projects together. And many of the reasons why we don't have more housing being built is because NIMBYs and some municipal practices will just bleed the developer dry until they just simply walk away. And there's many ways in which they do that. So that's a very common thing that we see in the developing community. So you can get these state and federal funds that will come if X, Y, and Z happens, but municipalities that are hostile to units being developed make sure that we never get to X, Y, Z, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate that you found that in the chat, because that got, I missed that. I saw the theme in the questions. I didn't catch the answer.
He's my boss. It's my job to make sure I pay attention to what he's saying. But very, very knowledgeable, and quick shout out to Tim. A lot of what the success Welcome Home Westchester has, and even just the manifestation of this organization has come from his ideals. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this. So
we're coming up on 8:15. So I'm actually going to say that it's probably last call on questions. I'll give everyone like maybe another half second to see if there's any last minute hands coming up.
I'm seeing a lot of stuff about ADUs and a lot of stuff about tiny houses, which I think, one of the goals of this is we stimulate more conversations outside of this. I used to say this is my 9 to 5, but it's a campaign, so it's my 24/7. So I'm going to put my information down here so we can always talk. And I see that Jan Fisher wants to say something. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so Jan, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to say in terms of tiny housing, I take exception to talking about it in terms of low income people. There's no data or conversation or research out there that low income people as a group are interested in tiny housing. We're discussing it as a they them type of thing. And I think should be really, really careful about that conversation, because tiny housing was more something that was developed probably on a more philosophical basis from people that had, I would say, were middle to upper income people that wanted to do something more environmentally correct, didn't want a lot of space. It's not, it sounds like a very they them conversation to me. Like that group of poor people we should consider tiny housing for them. So that's just how it feels to me, a very they them conversation.
Thank you. Very, very fair point. So I think that's a good point to wrap up. I'm going to say thank you very much to everybody who is here. And a very special thank you to Dana and Allison and Alex for presenting with me here today. I just want to let you all know Up to Us is having an event tomorrow. It's a phone bank for the Cortez Masto campaign in Nevada. So if anyone's interested in joining that, I'm going to put the link to that event in our chat. And if you want to help support for future events for Up to Us, we also, like I said, we're a completely volunteer and donation run organization. So if you'd like to consider making an event or making a donation to help support our events and programming, we would gladly say thank you. And I'll leave our email address in the chat as well. We'll follow up in the next few days with links to some of the white papers, the slides. We've recorded this, so this will be available for folks to refer back to again in the future. And if you have any other questions, we'll send out our contact information again as well. Thank you so much, everyone. I think this was a really wonderful conversation. I know that I definitely learned something tonight, and it was great to see everyone on this very Monday.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Everyone will get an email with all the information we talked about soon. So thank you.
Have a good night.